I think it's been an interesting panel conversation so far. Clearly, we have a big challenge in addressing the science and technology challenges of today and tomorrow, and I think it's great that ecosoc is initiating this conversation. I was interested to hear the Minister talk about the finance issue at the beginning of her conversation, and I think one of the great outcomes from Rio+20 was the setting up of the Expert Committee on Sustainable Development Finance. And hopefully that will, a bit like the Monterey process 10 years ago, collect together the best ideas on funding sustainable development, and perhaps provide a menu of options, maybe around the Human Development Index levels of development, so that you have packages for different levels of development which might be appropriate. And so clearly ODA will continue to play a role, but as Adnam indicated, there's been growth in Africa, so as countries move between different levels of development, I think that will be important to have the kinds of packages that relate to them. Some will move to much more domestic mobilization, or as we've seen, foreign direct investment. I think matching the new development goals and targets with effective and realistic funding will perhaps enable us to really go back to integrating economic, social and environmental dimensions. And we haven't really managed to do that effectively since 1992. And of course the agreements in 1992 were not delivered. So that goes to the issue of we have to be realistic about what we need to achieve in the financial packages in the world that we live in at this particular point. And just to take a step back for a second, we know that the global impacts of urbanization, we've heard that from the panelists, the increase in population and the impacts that will have, the impact of the emerging economies, and the impacts of climate change over the next 10 to 15 years. The estimations are that we'll see an increased energy demand of 30 to 40%, increased demand for food, for agriculture, production of 30 to 50%, and of course the demand for water will exceed availability by 40% by 2030. So huge challenges of that need to approach the nexus that Gary was mentioning. The interlinkages between those three crucial areas will be very important. And I've been on the panel with Gary before where he asked us to embrace complexity. And I'm not sure we're ready to embrace complexity, because the world we live in is no longer so simple. And it's not just the three dimensions that we need to look at, but we need to look across these sectors as well. So I think that's very important, that the connectivity between the three dimensions and the interlinkages between the major sectors, and there are others mentioned here today, are very important. So we need wins across as many of those sectors, and we need one development agenda that's going to be able to address this, and we need a constituency that's going to argue not just for sectors but across those sectors. The question, of course, is can we do this, and if so, how? And there's a role for ecosoc, I think, to start to develop that, that narrative. On Hunter's comments on companies, and I think there are some great examples. I think Unilever was a very good example. I think ACOM is also another good example. I think the work that Michael Anderson mentioned on the natural capital the UK government is doing, but it's also what a number of the companies are doing under the World Bank's initiative that came out of Rio+20. And I think that's also going to be very important. One of the failures of Rio+20 was, of course, that you didn't agree as governments to a global reporting framework, as had been on the table. And Hunter mentioned the South Africans, the Denmark, Brazil, Malaysia, a number of the countries that are doing this reporting using GRI or a different mechanism to do that. And where they're doing that, as Gary indicated, it's having a huge impact down the chain as far as companies sourced to those companies concerned. I think if one of the outcomes from Rio+20 was that we didn't achieve that, we need to look for a global framework on sustainability reporting, because we don't want 60 or 70 different processes. We want one, because that will make it easier for companies in the future. And I commend South Africa, Brazil, France and Denmark in taking forward the initiative from Rio Plus 20 and hope it will be part of what will come as the agenda for 2015. There's some very interesting solution platforms. You talked about partnerships, and I think we've had some problems over partnerships around the Johannesburg summit, so we need to re-look at that whole narrative around partnerships. But out of Johannesburg came the CEDAW initiative, Sustainable Entrepreneurs on Environment and Development, an interesting platform to look at solutions. You have the Jeffrey Sachs Solution Centre, which I think will play an increasing role as we move forward beyond the development goals being agreed. You have the Katerva Solution Centre and Awards, which look at global challenges like wastewater and urban issues. You had at Rio Plus 20 the African Development Bank and USAID's Grand Energy Challenge for Development, which I think is another interesting thing. And I don't know if anyone watches Star Trek here. I'm an avid Trekkie myself, but the tricorder, which was Dr. McCoy's way of telling whether you're ill or not, X-Prize have put up $10 million to have a tricorder in the next 2 years. If they succeed in doing that, we'll have a big impact on the health and the ability to address at least some of the concerns that people have. So I think those are some interesting solution and entrepreneur approaches that need to be integrated. And again, last week, 2 towns in California announced that they were introducing regulation that every new house had to have solar panels. Not optional, so I don't know how that goes to the liberty issue that Gary was questioning, but at least the communitarians in California are trying to do something about putting the right levers in, and I think that that's very important. I liked Adnam's question if there are win-win-wins out there. I don't think there are. I think there's a lot of losses if we don't take the right decisions. There's some major disruptions that are coming up which we should be taking consideration of in the context of all of our discussions. I'll just give you 3 or 4. 3D printers may have a huge impact on the issue of manufacturing in Asia, may actually blow the Chinese bubble up because people will be able to produce the materials themselves. Google's driverless cars will have a huge impact on taxis, lorries over the next 10, 15, 20 years. Taking education, iTunes have lessons up there, and last year there were 700 million downloads of lessons. So the impact on education for the future will be different. And if Star Trek is right and we have a tricorder, Google Health will be a major provider of medicine. So lots of disruptions that could cause, it's estimated, up to 2 billion loss of jobs over the next 15 years. Those need to be considered by ecosoc and need to be part of it. These technological challenges have very good environmental positive outcomes, but potentially very bad social and economic well-being for people. On the issue of stakeholders, which I was asked to finish on, I think that just as there are innovations in the area of science and technology, we'll see having an impact also on governance. Underlining the comments by Ian Noble this morning, I think the Future Earth Initiative is a really exciting one by the scientists where they're bringing in other stakeholders to work together. But I think the UN needs to look at the sectorization that they're doing for the science space. The IPCC, the IPBES is going down the same sector approaches that we've had. Maybe we need an overall intergovernmental panel on sustainable development, which will bring the science information into a coherent place. On Philip's points and the comments by this morning's speaker, Suz Ulbeck, what is missing is there needs to be mechanisms at all levels of governance, local, regional government and national government, to integrate stakeholders into the platforms. In fact, key countries have in fact closed down their Sustainable Development Councils. This morning, Michael talked about the Cabinet Committee. Well, the UK last year closed down the Sustainable Development Council in the run-up to Rio Plus 20. We need mechanisms for all stakeholders to be involved in helping to address the challenges that are in front of us. And we've had an evolution over the last 20 years of stakeholders. In '92, we had 9 chapters of Agenda 21, recognizing that better informed decisions will be taken if stakeholders were involved in those decisions. In 2002, it was that if stakeholders are involved in the implementation of those decisions that governments take, more likely or not those will be implemented. And if Rio Plus 20 was about one thing, it was about that stakeholders also need to be involved in the agenda setting. One final comment is that I think if you want to look at urban agriculture, I think we should ask Cuba to talk about the examples that they've had to do over the last 20 years as one of the best examples of how urban agriculture has been a success in a particular country which had very difficult economic challenges. Thank you.